And the countdown is done and the lights got brighter, so I guess we're getting started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first official external Dare to Dialogue event. My name is Abby Dreyer. I am the Director of Data Program Management here at Morningstar, and I'm also one of the co-founders of Morningstar Innovators, which is hosting this event. History of Dare to Dialogue here at Morningstar. It's an event that we've had internally for about a year, and we've been covering things from data privacy to racial wealth disparities. And the Dare to Dialogue events are meant to be a conversation about uncomfortable topics where people can ask questions and get answers from experts. Morningstar is a data company. We gather a lot of data, we do a lot of research, and we want to make sure that we're sharing that in a way that is educational and not, topics are controversial, but the data isn't. So we try to hit on that, and that's what this event is for today, opening up to our friends and colleagues outside of Morningstar so that we can talk about gender pay fairness. And I am joined by some lovely people here, but first I want to thank the Chicago Hearing Society for being here. And now we've got an echo in the room, we're good now. Chicago Hearing Society is here to help because we are working on being more inclusive at Morningstar, and this is one of the ways that we're doing that. And I'm going to read the introductions because I don't want to miss anything about the lovely panelists that we have here. So we have Diana van Maastek, who is joining us from Denmark. Is that where you are? No, I'm wrong.
No.
So,
Amsterdam.
From far away. So thank you for being here in your evening. Diana is the co-founder and CEO of Equileap, which is the leading provider of data and insights on gender equality in the corporate sector. And they research and rank 3,500 public companies around the world. So thank you for being here. We're also joined by Marianne Madden, who is the Director of Rewards at Willis Towers Watson, a lead business consulting firm. And Marianne co-leads the North America Fair Pay team and has 20 years of experience advising leaders on global pay practices. And last but not least, we have Sanjay Patel, who is our own global head of total rewards at Morningstar. And he has implemented compensation programs across many large firms, including Kellogg, Caterpillar, Kraft Heinz, and now Morningstar's own approach to gender pay fairness. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for being here. And for those who are on the Zoom, I do have a Brad here who is watching the Q&A and the chat. So this is meant to be a conversation. I have a couple of questions that we wanted to kind of set the stage with the panel. But please do not hesitate to ask questions throughout the event here. We will be finishing up at about 10 to the hour because Diana has another very important meeting to go to, so we want to make sure that we get as much as we can out of this event in a very short period of time. So ask as many questions as you want to. This is a safe space for us to talk about very important things. So let's get started with some context setting. So Sanjay, when we talk about a pay gap, what are we actually talking about?
So thanks, Abby. Great question. So let's do a little bit of context setting. So there's typically two types of pay gaps that companies would study. One is called an unadjusted pay gap, one's called an adjusted. So unadjusted gets to this concept of equal pay for opportunity. And roughly the calculation on it is you take whatever groups you're looking at, and so I know we're talking about gender pay here, so you look at the two genders and you would simply take a median or an average of those two different data sets and identify a pay gap. Now, when you identify a pay gap in that situation, there could be multiple reasons why you would have a gap. One could be a compensation problem, and one could be an opportunity problem, right? So if you have more men at higher paying jobs and roles, then potentially that explains the gap, which is more of a representation gap. So the unadjusted kind of gets at that concept, and it could address both compensation and representation issues at an organization. Then the other one that's a little bit more of a statistical, robust, analytical type of calculation is called an adjusted pay gap. And what you do there is you kind of take people in similarly situated groups or roles, and you would study many things that are legitimate drivers of compensation, right? Performance, experience in a role, experience overall, locations potentially, and you put it into a model, and then if there are things that are not explained, then perhaps gender differences in the compensation issues are related to the gender. So it's a little bit more robust, and it really gets at compensation differences. So both are very important, I think, for companies to look at because it kind of gets to potentially two different things.
And there was a correction that needed to be submitted to Ignites, right, where they kind of got the adjusted and unadjusted labels
That's right.
incorrect. So it's very important to pay attention to those labels and understand that we are looking at the right things. So thank you for setting that context. All right, so Diana, what trends are emerging on pay fairness disclosure? What information's out there?
Well, so like you mentioned, we research almost 4,000 companies around the world on gender equality. And one of the things that we research is, do they publish their pay gap? And what is the pay gap? And we look at unadjusted, well, we collect both data points, but we give points to companies for publishing their unadjusted pay gap. What we see is that there's an increase in the number of companies that are actually publishing their pay gap. So that's the good thing. And there's an increase both in the unadjusted and the adjusted. In the United States, one of the 23 countries that we look at, most companies, if they publish anything, they're publishing adjusted pay gap. We don't see that many companies in the United States publishing unadjusted. And also what we see is that it's very much linked to legislation. There's countries around the world that in the past few years have put in laws saying that companies with a number of employees have to publish their pay gaps. The UK is one of them, but Spain and Italy are two others. And we see that the more laws that we have, the more companies are publishing.
That makes sense. So do we have a general percentage of how many firms are disclosing this information? Do we know?
Worldwide, 17% of the almost 4,000 companies that we have are disclosing some form of pay gap, whether it's adjusted or unadjusted, worldwide. In the United States, it's 8%, which are publishing. So 92% of the US companies are not publishing anything. And to compare that to Spain, 92% of the Spanish companies are publishing. That gives you a nice comparison between the United States and Spain.
Yeah. Okay. And when we look at the differences as more disclosures are happening, is there any data that we see in some places that we don't see in others for those that are disclosing?
You mean in some countries, or what do you mean in places?
Just in general, like, is there a difference in specific data points that are in some places shared and in some places not shared, or is it the general data across the board?
What we see is that unless they are forced, many companies are not publishing their unadjusted pay gap because those numbers are huge. Like Sanjay said, when we look at people in similar roles, with similar backgrounds, with similar let's say, type of jobs that they're doing, the pay gap that exists is usually small. It's usually in the between 3% and maybe an 8%. And many times it's based on gender, ethnicity, that these people are being discriminated against and their pay is lower. But it's low. But when we look at unadjusted pay gaps of companies, because there are so few women in leadership positions, we see very, very few women at the CEO levels and the percentages of the executives, the percentages of the senior managers, then the unadjusted pay gap is sometimes huge, between 40, 70%. And that's why many times companies do not publish that.
That makes sense. Thank you. Okay, so we've got this data. So Marianne, once we have this data, what should companies do to ensure fairness? Having data is one thing, using it is another.
So what we find is that organizations that I work with are looking at the data in two different ways. Sometimes it is around what is being disclosed in a CSR, an ESG report, or even potentially an SEC filing, or what a company is disclosing on their website, and that's typically their pay gaps. So as Diana mentioned, we definitely in the US are finding a lot more adjusted pay gaps. Some organizations who have been pressured by investors have also shared their unadjusted pay gaps. But what we find in terms of the level of detail or who is included in those calculations, it can really vary because In the United States, we don't necessarily have a governing body on how those calculations need to be prepared, what population needs to be included in them. So it's a little bit of apples and oranges if you're trying to compare one organization to another. And there's often footnotes in terms of understanding the populations that are included, if it's a global number versus a US-only number. Some organizations are much more proactive in sharing information around the actual number of employees that are being impacted from the pay gaps, or potentially the amount of money that they have needed to adjust their pay. But what we would say is that is the only thing that's being shared, companies are really losing an opportunity to help employees understand and build trust in the pay processes and programs and underlying structures that are in place. Meaning that the goal, in terms of sharing the information publicly is usually from an investor perspective or government regulation perspective. But from the employee perspective, there is a process of helping them understand that there is a consistent and fair process in place in order to make pay decisions. And there are organizations that have started to move in that direction. It's not something that they started in 2022. They definitely started, they'll actually say, in 2015, 2017, we began this journey. And what they have done is actually outline their fair pay principles and priorities and what their commitments are. Unilever is a great example. So is Standard Charter, as well as Vodafone. And what they have all done is outline their commitments. Pay equity is one of them, but they've also outlined the other aspects of fair pay that are important to them. And it varies by company, because again, there isn't necessarily this is what you need to include, but at the same time, it's very personal to those organizations, meaning the types of commitments or pillars that they've listed in their public websites are aspects around executive employee pay, living wage or income security, inclusive benefits, market competitiveness, pay transparency, and how they've ultimately developed these commitments. They've aligned them to their own vision and mission. They've aligned them to their business imperatives, as well as their diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. So it's a very comprehensive way of helping not only investors and the public at large understand what's important to the organization in terms of pay, but also for job candidates as well as employees.
Awesome. Thank you. That's a lot.
There's a lot going on out there.
There's a lot going on. Well, good. There should be a lot going on.
Yeah.
So, Diana, as we're talking about how companies are doing new and interesting things, and Morningstar is having a focus on ESG, how are investors looking at gender pay fairness? Does it make a difference in which companies investors are looking at?
Yes, sure. There's been a growth in ESG investing for sure. And within ESG investing, we've seen a growing interest in in social issues. So one of the issues that investors are talking about is the gender pay gap. And they are using it, whether it's as a specific data point to go into ESG integration, or they're using it with other gender equality data points to build indices or do portfolio management. So I see an interest. And what is also interesting is that, for you guys on the other side of the world, so in Europe, the SFDR new regulations are looking into 14 specific ESG criteria for portfolio transparency. And one of these 14 is the pay gap. They want to know if companies are publishing the pay gap. They're not putting any judgment on whether the pay gap is large or small, but they are saying we want to see the companies publish the pay gap. So I think that that's interesting, and I have been reading that also the SEC in the United States is considering looking into these as one of the important issues for transparency. So I think that when we look at ESG issues and we look at the S issues, pay parity and closing the pay gap is definitely one of them.
Awesome. So as an investor, if I'm if I want to invest in a company that's committed to fairness and not just committed to reporting, what should I be looking for?
Well, you should definitely start by who's reporting. That's where it starts. I think that a company that says we're trying to close our pay gap, but we're not going to report it, I wouldn't believe them. It starts by reporting.
Definitely, yeah.
And being open about it. I think that, there's been CEOs around the world who have said, some banks in the United States who have said, I know we have a terrible pay gap, but I'm starting to publish it, and we're going to report it every year, and we're going to start to work to close it. So I think that that's important. Now, it's also very clear that in order to close the pay gap, you have to look at both, are your employees getting the same salary for the same type of background as far as their resumes, their CVs, and their work? And do you have the same amount of percentages of the groups that you're looking at the levels? So, for example, if you want to close the ethnic and racial pay gap of African Americans compared to white people, you would have to have the exact same percentage represented at the different levels. Otherwise, you will still have a pay gap. And that's the same for gender. So you have to have the representation of at the different levels, from the board all the way down to management and the work floor.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. All right, Sanjay, as someone who has worked on pay equity at several large firms, what are the obstacles that companies face when they're disclosing gender pay data?
So I'll answer that in addition to my experience at other companies, but just also broadly what I hear amongst my peers. So I would say, generally obstacles, I think some of them are very obvious, right? There's a little bit of risk aversion, right? I mean, there's we're going to do the study, and we're going to have to communicate a gap. Okay, so now we have to communicate a gap. Now we have to communicate why we have a gap and what caused that and how long it's been. So I think there's a little bit of risk aversion on that particular topic. I think there's a little bit also, well, what if our gap is really big, and we want to try to close that? Okay, well, those could be potentially big dollars. Are we ready to do something like that? So I think companies struggle with that. I'm seeing a lot of good progress on that front. I think the other one, I talked a little bit about budget availability, right? Companies don't necessarily proactively budget for things like that. So it makes sense for companies to start thinking about, okay, well, next year, as I'm thinking about, our labor costs, this is something that I have to put in there as a budget item. I think the other one is potentially data availability. So I talked about doing this adjusted pay gap, and there are a number of things, some of which are pretty common and obvious that most companies would have, performance. But then when you start parsing the data into overall experience, right? We have the experience at our particular company, how many years somebody's been there, but then they've had other years at other companies. That's harder to get, right? And so if you want to do the analysis, you got to do it right, and you have to be able to get some of that data. I get a lot of questions at several of my companies, right? We track gender pretty well, but we don't always track minorities necessarily well all around the world. Some of that's due to some data privacy issues and things like that, but you can't measure what you can't get data for. So that's been a challenge for some companies. So I think those are kind of the bigger areas I think companies face as obstacles to do that. I've seen a lot of actually really positive things. Regulation, which I'm sure we'll get into, is a positive thing. External stakeholders taking an interest in this, investors, various different affinity groups taking interest in this. Availability of very good tools that are sophisticated tools that help companies do this. And I'd say the last sort of real positive thing is that seeing some companies not try to boil the ocean on this, right? So let's start small. Let's do an overall global study next year, because you get questions, right? Employees start asking, well, what about this particular smaller group? Have you studied that, right? So start with something, start small with a bigger group, and then you can start parsing into things in a little bit more detail. And I think that's a better approach typically for companies to take.
Sounds good. Sounds like Sounds like good things are happening, even though there are what used to be insurmountable challenges, right? I think
right.
we're seeing a lot of good progress there, so that's great. So, Marianne, New York City is going to be requiring job requisites to include salary ranges soon. Is that right? Yeah?
Yes, and it's scheduled, at least for now, to occur in May. But they aren't the first municipality to actually require this. Colorado has a similar law that went into effect last year and has similar requirements. And in fact, we see this as a trend that will continue to occur. Just in the last 2 months, the state of California has proposed a new law that would require pay ranges and job postings, and the state of Washington just last month also enacted a law that will require companies to post that information in 2023. So what's interesting, though, because there's like this whole torrent of laws out there, that there are already pay transparency laws, or what we're calling is pay transparency laws, out there in several states. And California and the state of Washington do have laws in place. However, the nuance that's difference between the current law and the proposed law is that the current law requires the job seeker or the job candidate to actually request the pay range information during their interview process. And I'm pretty sure that not many job seekers in either of those states understand they have the right to that information. And I'm also pretty sure that companies aren't voluntarily sharing this information, handing it over to the job seeker, at some point because they didn't ask, because they're not even sharing it with their own employees. Like when I've been talking with clients about, how they're preparing, like what they're thinking about, they're getting into like very minute details about logistics around these pay ranges. And, we're asking them, well, are you going, like, let's think about this holistically. Like, maybe we should think about this, how you might want to apply this to your entire population versus just the locations where you're mandated. So, and it's not just here in the US. The EU Pay Transparency Directive also has a provision within that will require pay ranges to be shared. So it's not a law or the type of law that we see going away, and feel as though that more information is better information, not only to the job seeker, but I find that some clients that I work with, they're a mess. It's all about good pay management, and it's a little bit of making those companies get their act together so that way they have a plan in place, they're organized when they're making pay offers, when they're setting pay salaries for their internal employees, they're doing it in a consistent and fair way.
Okay. So where those regulations exist, do we see, what kind of changes do we see versus places that don't have those regulations? Like, is the regulation making a tangible difference? Like the regulation for reporting, we see more reports. This one I think is a little bit stickier, especially with loopholes and nuances like that, where are these regulations making a difference towards pay fairness or not?
So what we would say is, I haven't necessarily seen any research about it, but when the salary bands laws that came into effect back in 2018, they did have a positive relationship between closing pay gaps between women and minorities. But we would say, in general, that organizations such as World Bank, who has a report called Women, Business, and Law, and they report it every year. Their 22 report actually calls out that regulations do have a positive impact on women. It also has a positive impact on economies at large. And there's a couple nuances because I know this one is particular to pay ranges, but the types of laws that we're looking at in the US can be very different from the rest of the world. For example, there is a law in Gabon that is a or a Central African country that this year or in the last year or so, they enacted legislation that allows women to obtain employment without their husband's approval. So we still have those types of laws that we're we're trying to make progress for. And then there's also nuances that we don't consider until there is some sort of technicality that comes up. And a good example around that is the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009, which it's a great story. Lily Ledbetter was a plant manager for Goodyear Tire. She received an anonymous tip that she was being paid thousands less than her male counterparts. She filed a complaint with the EEOC. She won $3.5 million in damages. Goodyear Tire unfortunately appealed, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled in Goodyear's favor under a technicality. The technicality was that Lily had not brought forth her complaint within a 180-day window when she had originally received the pay discrimination. And as a result of this, our former Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote a dissent where she wrote about how it's virtually impossible to know that you're being discriminated against. You know, this is an anonymous note that she received telling her that this was happening. And as a result, Congress listened, and they enacted the law. And President Obama, this was one of his first laws that he actually signed when he became president. But now, instead of that 180-day window, it resets for every paycheck that's discriminatory. So it's not just a benefit to women, it's a benefit to everyone in terms of fair pay and discriminatory practices, because our perspective when we're working with clients is that white men should have the same pay as a woman of color, that that everyone should have the same opportunity and have a consistent and fair approach in terms of how pay decisions are made.
That is a great story.
Yes,
It's also a very sad story.
it is a sad story.
All right, so with these nuances and regulations and, with changing, job marketplace, Sanjay, what would you recommend to applicants who want to be paid fairly? What kinds of questions should they ask, and what should they be looking for?
Great question. So I would answer that to say sort of, get to a couple different areas, right? Think about, pushing on competitive practices and then what the regular review processes are, right? So it's things such as, okay, you're applying for a role, what are the compensation ranges to the extent the company has it, or what would you say about the compensation kind of ranges and that the company's considering? I would ask one very important question too, as you think about internal equity, which is after coming to some kind of discussion on the compensation, ask the question, if I accepted this, would I be in line with similarly situated people at the company? I think that's one thing that people don't necessarily get at. And then I would ask about regular review processes. How often do they occur? What are going to be the things that you look at to determine compensation increases? So I think those are some things you can ask as a candidate. I think there's other great things, as we talked about in various corporate sustainability reports, various public filings like the proxy statement, to get some indication on the posture for pay fairness. There's great ways to research that. And then, I would ask about what are pay equity practices? We talked a lot about this, right? So how often do you review pay equity in your organization, and how do you remedy those situations? So there's a lot of great questions I think candidates can ask. Sometimes you won't get full answers on all of them, but those are things that I would recommend anyone to ask.
Yeah, it's always good, job seekers doing research on the companies they're applying for. It's a great first step, and I think that's some really helpful information. Once the interview happens, and this is a question for both Marianne and Diana, once you're in the interview, how can we, hiring managers, kind of check our own unconscious bias when we are setting the salaries for who we're about to hire? What can we do so that we don't create the pay inequity and the lack of fairness in pay? What can hiring managers do, not just applicants? Who wants to go first? Let's go, Diana.
Sure. I am inspired by this law in Germany, and I think that this is something that all managers should do. What you can do is look at the average salaries in your team. What are the men earning, and what are the women earning on average? And you can do that also with ethnicity. You can do it with any kind of group. In Germany, there's a law that allows women who, if you work in a team of 6 people or more, you can go to your HR officer and ask for this information and say, in my team, what do the men on average earn? And then you can compare your salary to that. So I think that that's one thing that you can do the whole time to see if you're giving equal wages for equal work. And then the other thing, for as far as the pay gap unadjusted. Is your team gender balanced? Do you have both men and women represented in at least, a bracket of 40 to 60%? I think that 50% is usually impossible, but in a 40 to 60%, is your team balanced?
Those are great things to look for. Thank you. Maria, what do you think?
I would just add that, pay shouldn't be done in a vacuum, and that managers should consult with their compensation or HR teams to ensure that the offers that they're preparing are fair, as well as some of the things that Diana mentioned, that you're not providing an offer that will somehow cause a pay equity issue with your team or even potentially across the entire organization. Because the laws look at similarly situated jobs. It doesn't look necessarily at the reporting structure. It doesn't care about that. It's looking across jobs. It can look across locations. And so you, as a manager, likely don't have that purview. But having a review, approval, exception process in place is important, so that way pay gaps can be caught before they become an issue, or potentially if you're bringing someone in, are you bringing them in at the right job level even? That can be, the job is advertised as X, this person might be bringing in Y. Maybe it's not the exact same job and there needs to be a discussion about it. And maybe we still need them, but that just means that you make sure that they get hired into the right role instead of right-sizing that person somehow into the role. Because I've heard both things happen where someone's going to pay outside the range but put them in the role because they have concerns about whether or not the person can do the job, versus, or maybe they're bringing more to the job and don't feel comfortable putting into the next job because it was not approved. So it comes really back to good pay management. And I've actually had clients say that they don't want to be the compensation police. But ultimately, if there isn't a governance process in place, who is looking at this to make sure that there is a consistent process? Because it all comes back to underlying processes and programs that are in place to ensure that pay can be made in a consistent manner.
If I can add to that.
Absolutely.
One of the things Mary and I talked about, in organizations that hire a lot, right, it's hard, right? This is difficult, right? Think about this, right? We want to pay internally equitable, we want to pay competitive to the market, and we want to pay exactly what or we want to try to pay what the candidate is asking. Those three numbers very often are not the same, right? So when you make a decision on compensation, you're going to throw some of it off a little bit. And we talked about this concept of, you want to get it right on a pay equity standpoint, but there are great things that companies do, and we encourage them to do them often on fixing those issues so that they don't stay very long. But it is a difficult thing just to put it out there for companies to address.
Yeah, I work at Morningstar, but I am not a numbers person. And so you just listed three numbers and my brain is already struggling with the math. So with that, so we've got about 20 minutes and it's all my questions. So Brad, what do we have on the Zoom?
Actually, the first question leads right into this. So,
Nice.
because you mentioned candidates when you're kind of looking into it. But the first question is, if I know I am not being paid fairly, so now you've done some of these, you've seen this by comparing the compensation with others in the same role at the company. So what are those steps for the individual? What's the best way to handle and address that with the company?
That is a great question.
So I'll start with an answer, but my colleagues can help me out. So I think this is another dilemma for the company, right? We do our work and we sort of put people in similarly situated roles, right? And that's a process, right? And as you would guess, right, an employee could create their own groups, right? So sometimes those analyses aren't the same, right? And so I think the one thing I would say is that is the type of thing you bring up to your manager as something that they should think about and address. Make sure that your manager's clear on what your analysis was for that. But typically the companies are maybe doing something slightly different. So sometimes you have to come to some kind of alignment on that. But I would bring it up with managers, bring it up with your HR individuals if that's a concern.
Yeah, I think being able to have a candid conversation with one's manager is really important for stuff like this. And I think the last thing any hiring manager wants is to find out that somebody found something out, didn't talk about it, and just went somewhere else, right? So communication is key. So, do we have any other questions?
Yeah, we got two questions I think kind of tie in here. I'll just ask the questions and then kind of see if we go. So what about the role? What about if the role has a very wide gap in experience? So someone on my team can be almost a fresh grad, and then there's someone else that has 15 years of experience for that same role. How do you address that if there's a huge pay gap there? And then there was another question that was asked about the role of education. So same role, different education backgrounds, or so different education or different backgrounds. How do those play into this when you might have those bigger pay gaps, even though it's the same role there?
Do you want me to take it? Okay. So in terms of explainable reasons, or if we get into the law, defensible reasons, experience is one of them, education is another, location, even working conditions or working hours. So it's basically, the individual themselves, performance is also an indicator. So those all come into play in terms of the analysis that gets done. So in the example where you have someone that's very new versus someone's very experienced, you would expect there to be a pay gap, but within, certain reason, because there tends to be at a certain point, if you're in this exact same job level, performance is the same, but clearly you're having someone has more experience or less. You get to a point where having more years of experience doesn't necessarily add substantially to the pay, if that makes sense. You kind of slow down, like at the beginning, you might have a ramp up and you have much more in terms of pay increases, and then as you start to, 20 years versus 2. So we would expect there to be a difference in pay gap. And that would be something that when we look at the results of the analysis, that would be explainable reason. This person is brand new to the role, this person has 20 years in the role, and they're bringing, different things to the table. The other question is that person's in the exact same job? Because I would question it, it's possible, but at the same time, 20 years versus, that's where, could they be doing something more and aren't necessarily leveled the same way? And then, was there a second part to that question?
The education, if education is
So
different.
the education can come into play. The caveat is that education needed for the job? So in some cases, you need that education requirement to even be hired into the role, or shortly after, or maybe it's a certification. For others, someone could come in with a PhD, but you're only requiring a bachelor's. You're not going to pay them for a PhD unless the job really requires that. So that's a nuance of sometimes someone bringing more to the table than is required, and it's more of a difficult conversation of helping them understand, well, this is what the job requires, and while I understand you have more than that, we don't feel as though we should be paying for it because we have other people in this job that are doing this with different education requirements.
So my master's degree in puppeteering isn't going to
Yes.
have an impact.
Yes, I love that.
Good degree, but.
Yes.
And I'll
I
add.
think it's a really good question.
Go ahead.
I think it's a really good question. Because I think that this is one thing that specifically for gender comes into play. And if you are performing the same tasks as the other person and you're expected to do the same outputs, and you're having the same output, performing the same tasks, then I really don't think that having the much more years of experience should count. And this is something that is used against women many times, that women come back to their job after they have taken 2, 3, 6 years off to take care of their children. They come back and then they're told, you're not going to earn as much as your male colleagues because you don't have as much of a background. Well, they're expected to do the same tasks and to perform the same output. So I think in that case, you have to really think about it and say, is it the same job? Am I doing this? Am I being evaluated in the same way? Then I should be paid the same. And I shouldn't be given a lower pay just because I took 6 years off my career. I also would say that you come back with other skills after having taken care of, 2, 3 snotty kids and
As a
driving
parent,
them all
I
over the place.
agree, 100%.
Yes.
And
So I think that it's really important that you look at the job and the team you're in. Same task, same output. It should be the same job, the same pay range.
And I think companies take different approaches on what all those things that go into this adjusted pay calculation. I'm going to go back to 1.2. A lot of this is about data availability, right? So when we talk about education, okay, probably most companies would track that, but to Mary Ann's point, education that's pertinent for this role, okay, well, that's another data field that you have to do. So whether or not that you consider that a legitimate factor to drive pay, then there's the second question of data availability. And I think a lot of companies struggle with some of those things. We'd like to do pay studies on 10 different, sort of attributes and factors, but we don't have availability to do that. We're getting better at it, though.
Nice, okay.
So, and maybe this kind of follows up on it a little bit. There was a follow-up question on this. To these points of, there's various levels there, or various factors. It's easy for the employer to keep you in your place with these reasons, exactly. So what's troubling now is the gap that we're seeing between long-term employees and a lot of external hires who are coming in through this hot market. So any comments on how to approach the conversation itself?
So so I'll answer maybe, how companies could think about it, right? So I think that that's real, right? I mean, there's a very hot labor market, and that's what's happening externally. I would advocate then these are great reasons why pay equity studies and remedies should be done multiple times, right? Because then you can sort of capture some of those things that are happening and make adjustments internally as you need to. So, companies should be thinking about doing these studies more than once every other year, more than once a year, right? So that they can address those. But it's not easy, right? I mean, you're going to get people for maybe a short period of time at least, where an external person might be making more.
All right, before Brad takes another question, do we have any questions in the audience? We do have people with microphones. We have a hand up. Who's going to bring the mic? Let's see what happens here. It's a race.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Trisha. Thanks for the conversation. Is there any conversation happening about pay equity for those who live outside of the gender binary, so non-binary, two-spirited, gender-fluid folks, etc.?
So you want me to take that?
Thank you for that question. Yeah.
Yes, so it's a great question. And what we tend to find is while it will come up when I'm working with clients on conducting these types of analysis, they often don't have that data available. And so, what happens is if the federal government or states start mandating it, that means that companies start collecting it. That means that's something that we can test against. And we would say that, that's a great question about the non-binary, but, it's also from the race ethnicity perspective, the age perspective. Recently had a client where they're very interested in veteran status. So that's something that we could also be looking at to see if there's gaps occurring. You can basically as much demographic information as a company has, the more the better, and we love it because we'll look at it all different ways and we'll say, okay, at a company view, you look okay, but let's start look at these locations or this division or this product line. We can look and we can start pinpointing where we see gaps occurring. And sometimes it's a concentration of employees and sometimes it's a onesie twosie, which we can't really say, what's happening here. But we would say we would encourage companies to be looking at that, and it's definitely something that's on the radar for I think many states, as well as many companies themselves. And the one thing that I would say is that's interesting around that collection of that data, especially in the U.S., because overseas, some countries you can't do it. It's illegal. You can't collect anything other than gender information. Is that if you mark undisclosed as either your gender or your race ethnicity, that means that you get put in this extra bucket. And we still look at you, but at the same time, if you were to raise your hand and you had all these demographics that make you minority and protected, the company doesn't know that. So if anything, it's for your advantage to actually report that information when you're asked for it, so that way you can be included as one of those protected categories. Because I had one client where a huge population, it was a retail organization, had non-disclosed. It was like 3,000 employees. And we're like, do they realize that this actually would benefit them, in a way that they probably are thinking, oh, it's either too much information that I'm sharing, or, I'm too busy, I'm just going to mark non-disclosed. But it's there, from a law perspective, and I'm not an attorney, but I work with a lot of attorneys with the work that we do, that it's something that, that they can't say, oh, well, they didn't realize that this person was, protected because they didn't disclose their protected status.
And I think another challenge is the gender binary is so ingrained in all of the documentation that we have. To Sanjay's earlier points, if we don't have the data, then
Right.
we can't do anything with it, and sometimes you can't put that data in.
Right.
So I think that's, further regulations that we can hope for to fix the way that people can self-identify in the HR system so that we can act on that. Yeah. All right, I think we have time for one more question. Do we have one in the room or in the Zoom?
I've got one on the Zoom.
We have shy people in
Okay.
the room, so we'll go with the Zoom.
All right, so on the Zoom, and these two kind of tie up, so I'm going to try to put them both in, and they're both related to kind of this hot labor market. So what have you observed about which demographics are most impacted, positively or negatively, by the hot labor market that we've had in the past year or so? Has pay increased evenly across gender and race? And then this was a comment, but I'll ask for a comment on the comment. Pay of current employees in a hot labor market. Academic researchers in the space, like Lazier, Gibbs, and Cole, would recommend increasing pay immediately for all current employees once we realize the market pay rate has changed for the role. Not doing so causes difficult scenarios to pop up and underestimates the job-specific skills that current employees have. So any comments on that comment as well?
All right, I'm trying to remember the first part of the question.
The first one is, are there demographics
Oh,
that are
yeah,
specifically
yeah.
up and down? And the
Yeah.
second one is, what are your thoughts on increasing everyone to the upper market?
So what is interesting is that as a result of the pandemic, and now we have this hot labor market, the equal pay day was last month, and women are now at 83 cents on the dollar for every man in the U.S., which last year it was 82 cents, it was 81, 80. So that sounds like progress. But the problem is, as a result of the pandemic, of the layoffs and companies that shut down or stopped working, it impacted women the most. And so as a result, we have fewer women in the workforce than we have had. While that number, that statistic now looks good, it actually is making scholars and researchers who pay attention to this pause, because now the goal is how can we get those women back into the workforce. And so in terms of the hot labor market, I have not seen anything in terms of, X and Y has had a better impact. I would say that the research that I had seen was more around the impacts of like the salary band history, which has been in effect for a couple of years now, that had a positive impact on women and minorities. Hopefully with the pay range laws that are coming into effect, that also has a positive impact, because with some workers, they're looking at the job posting to understand if they're even going to be able to afford their basic necessities, such as rent, their clothing and food, or if they're going to have to get a second job in order to pay their bills. So there's a whole other demographic out there that these laws are also looking to support. And, in terms of where women and minorities, I don't know if we'll know until, after we see what happens with this coming year. Because the other thing that I would add is the salary budgets. There were the salary budgets this year were around 3%, which, and maybe a little bit higher, and it's been 3% for a number of years. And that was surprising to a lot of people, including myself. But the thing is, I worked with so many companies that started to do these off-cycle adjustments. And that's not included in the 3% that is just your annual salary increase budget. So there's been all these off-cycle adjustments that have occurred with companies, and that's not being accounted for. So the things that you mentioned in the second part of the comment, I would completely agree with. And with the clients that I've been working with over the past year, that's what they're doing. I wouldn't say they're chasing the market, but they're trying to chase the market. Some of them are actually looking at that living wage and what that should be, and should it be from $15 to $20? What can they do? How can they make sure that there's not compression between the lower level jobs and those that it creeps up to? So there's a whole, it's always interesting because I feel like I've dealt with some clients, or even when I was in-house, some people were like, oh, I can do comp. This isn't a big deal. But it's complicated. There's a lot of nuances, and you have to segment employees differently and jobs differently, so that way you're treating jobs the way they should be and employees the way they should be.
All right, and I see Diana has to run, so thank you so much for being here. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening. And she's gone now, so we've got about a few more minutes. Do we have any other questions, or we have food outside? So I don't want to be between.
We do have another question.
We have another question.
Okay. There are websites where employees can submit their compensation anonymously, assuming like sites like Glassdoor, and search for aggregated data points. How helpful do you see these websites to candidates?
So, honestly, we have done some crowdsourcing data for clients who, when you look at the survey data, compensation survey data, it lags. It's like right now is when companies are submitting data to companies like WTW to publish compensation surveys. Those then get published like in August to October. So, we're hoping that it's as up-to-date information as possible. But going out there and doing crowdsourcing like you're suggesting is something that we've done for clients where we've said, okay, is this number still realistic? The thing that we would say as a compensation professional, because as I mentioned, I was a compensation manager for a company at one point in time, you can get anything shared with you in terms of, this is what it says my job should be. It's like, well, are all these people the exact same, like, job level? Or is it potentially they're in a different job? Or they're in a different expertise? The one nice thing about the third-party surveys, and the reason why there's laws around how the data needs to be collected and how old or new the surveys can be, is that there's processes behind the scenes to make sure that the data is being collected are for like jobs versus, and it's coming from HR to validate it. I know that there's internal processes to make sure that jobs are being matched correctly. So there's a lot of things that go into those numbers. And, I would say it's a helpful point, but it's kind of like when, even when we do the pay equity analysis itself, it's a data point. But that doesn't mean that that is the absolute pay that person should be paid. And it's for those things that we were talking about, education or experience, because there's a lack of data that we can test in the model. So there's often an investigation process to understand, well, how is this person different from their peers? And is there a valid reason for why they should be paid differently from their peers? And, so it's not just we take the number and we're crossing it off and we're moving on. There's a lot of work that goes in behind the scenes to ensure that, even that analysis and that process is, governed and organized, and there's rationale, and legal counsel is often involved to ensure that, you're not just saying something and because you don't like the person and you don't want to pay them more.
So I agree with that. I would just say again, the compensation data from the survey houses is probably the most scrubbed, so it's the most, I think, legitimate. I think that people could use information on Glassdoor for directional guidance,
Yep.
right? So the last time we studied this from the survey houses, it was this, and look, it's a hot labor market, and generally, directionally, we're seeing comments and data on Glassdoor doing this, and so it's directionally helping you.
Oh, I have a hand raised. We need a microphone because we're on the Zoom.
Hello.
Hello.
My question may be just general one. How are companies that are multinational uniquely suited to address gender pay gap versus regional companies that may just have more of a local presence?
I like that question.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I feel like it's more, I would have expected race, ethnicity, and that one's a simple one because the data is just not available widely outside of the U.S. I don't necessarily see a difference. Like, I work with some companies that are only here in the U.S. and may only have 1 or 2 locations. I have others where they're global, in lots of different countries. I think the differences often with the analysis can be tied to the different laws in the countries because, I mentioned Gabon. Like, clearly, I don't even know if they have equal pay laws. But what happens is across the world, the equal pay laws, while they are fairly consistent in what their meaning is, the teeth behind it and whether or not companies are complying with that law is a whole other story. Like, we would say the US law, like, it's over here. Like, the laws in Europe are all the way over here because they're much more progressive. They're requiring companies to report their pay gaps. They're actually requiring them to report on action planning on how they're closing the pay gaps. So it's taking that next step, which we love to see. It's that it all comes back to good pay management and forcing companies to do what they should be doing all along, rather than, in the US, it's they should be doing this. This is like a normal part of business because if they don't, they could be sued or audited. And that's just really the crux that's in the background. And the states and the, local and country laws are the ones that are really driving this a lot more than what we see just from a federal level. So I don't necessarily see it too much from a U.S. versus the rest of the world. I would say Canada's kind of out here in a weird realm, but it's because of they have different, they have pay equity laws, but they're very different from the U.S. But it sounds like some companies are starting to want to look at it the way that the U.S. and the U.K. And the EU are proposing to look at it.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining today and for asking such great questions and daring to dialogue with us today. I want to thank you both for joining us here and talking about this lovely topic that I hope keeps moving in the right direction. I think, Pay Equity Day started however long ago, and it was way later than April before. So
Yes.
as we continue on this journey, I think what I'm taking away is keep doing research, keep learning how companies are reporting, how the reporting's changing and adapting, and what companies are doing with that data. And then from an individual standpoint, paying attention to where you are in the market compared to your peers and having those candid conversations with your managers. Does that sound about right? Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Yeah.